In April 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed in slow motion across a devastated continent, there existed a city that seemed untouched by the chaos consuming Europe. This was Weimar, a jewel of German civilization, resting peacefully in the heart of Thuringia. From above, the city appeared almost dreamlike in its preservation. Elegant Baroque buildings lined cobblestone streets that had witnessed centuries of intellectual achievement. The morning sun cast golden light across rooftops that showed no scars of war, no craters from Allied bombs, no evidence of the apocalypse unfolding across Germany. The main square bustled with a peculiar normalcy that would have seemed impossible anywhere else in the dying Reich. Civilians in carefully pressed 1940s attire walked with purpose and dignity. Horse-drawn carriages clattered across ancient stones. Women in fashionable dresses carried shopping baskets. Men in tailored suits and fedoras discussed business and philosophy in sidewalk cafes, as if the world beyond their city limits existed, in some alternate reality they need not acknowledge. This was not a city that had merely survived the war. This was a city that had seemingly ignored it entirely. Goethe's house stood as it had for generations, surrounded by cherry blossoms that bloomed with indifferent beauty each spring. The great poet and philosopher had walked these same streets, contemplating the heights of human reason and artistic achievement. Weimar wore this legacy like a shield, as if cultural sophistication could create an invisible barrier against the darkness that had consumed the nation. The theater district maintained its ornate dignity. Opera houses and concert halls continued their performances. Even as the Third Reich crumbled, scholars still entered the Grand Library with armfuls of books, pursuing intellectual endeavors as though knowledge itself could sanctify the ground beneath their feet. The central clock tower's bells rang out each hour with mechanical precision, marking time in a city that seemed determined to pretend time had stopped somewhere before 1933, before everything changed. Children played in parks. Vendors sold fresh produce in markets. The wealthy residential districts displayed their manicured gardens with pride. University students debated philosophy in the conservatory, where music floated through open windows on spring breezes. This was civilization. This was culture. This was refinement. Everything the world associated with the best of German heritage existed here in careful preservation. Yet from certain vantage points, if one looked toward the horizon beyond the city's elegant boundaries, a dark forested hill called Ettersberg rose against the sky. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, a peculiar smell drifted down into Weimar's streets. Sometimes smoke could be seen rising from beyond those trees. Sometimes trains arrived in the night, their cattle cars full of human cargo, and departed empty before dawn. But the people of Weimar had learned not to look in that direction. They had perfected the art of not seeing what was 5 miles away. The road that connected Weimar to Ettersberg Hill was not long. 5 miles, a distance that could be walked in less than 2 hours. A short drive by automobile, close enough that smoke from one could be seen from the other, close enough that screams on quiet nights might carry on the wind. Yet in the minds of Weimar's citizens, this road might as well have stretched across continents, separating their world of culture from whatever existed beyond the tree line. The road itself bore witness to truths the city denied. Deep ruts carved by countless trucks, tire tracks that never quite faded, muddy paths worn smooth by thousands of shuffling feet, most belonging to men and women who would never walk back down. The forest pressed in from both sides, tall pines creating shadows even in daylight, as if nature itself recoiled from what lay ahead. This was the path of suffering that Weimar chose not to acknowledge. Every week for years, columns of prisoners had climbed this road under armed guard. Starving men in striped uniforms, their wooden clogs leaving marks in the mud. Women whose bodies had been reduced to bone and sinew, barely able to stand against the wind that whistled through the trees. Children torn from their families, marched toward a fate their innocence could not comprehend. From the air, the geographical reality was undeniable. Beautiful Weimar, with its intact buildings and flowering gardens, sat in plain view of the dark hill that rose beyond. The distance that separated them was nothing, a morning's walk, a brief journey. Yet the moral distance the citizens of Weimar had constructed was infinite. They had turned 5 miles into an unbridgeable chasm, an unknowable void, a place that existed beyond the boundaries of their awareness. As the road climbed higher up Ettersburg, the forest grew denser. The oppressive weight of the place could be felt in the very air. This was not merely a hill. It was a monument to how close evil could exist to ordinary life, how death could flourish within sight of those who claimed civilization as their birthright. The final approach revealed the first signs of what had been hidden here. Barbed wire appearing between trees, watchtowers rising above the forest canopy, the smell growing stronger with each step. And then, emerging from the shadows of the forest, the truth revealed itself in steel and wire and wood. Buchenwald concentration camp, the place Weimar claimed not to know. The main gate of Buchenwald stood as a grotesque monument to Nazi cynicism. Wrought iron formed the words, "Jedem das Sein," to each what he deserves, a philosophical statement twisted into mockery, greeting prisoners with the lie that their suffering was somehow justified, that justice had brought them to this place of systematic murder. On April 11, 1945, when American forces arrived, these gates finally opened, not to admit more victims, but to liberate those who had survived. From above, the true scale of Buchenwald became horrifyingly clear. This was not a random collection of buildings. This was an engineered system of death, designed with German precision and efficiency. Multiple rings of barbed wire fencing stretched in geometric perfection, creating zones of imprisonment within imprisonment. Watchtowers positioned at strategic intervals ensured constant surveillance. Every angle covered, every escape route blocked, every moment watched. The main compound sprawled across the hilltop in organized rows. Wooden barracks stood in military precision, each identical to the next, housing hundreds of prisoners in conditions designed to break both body and spirit. The parade ground, or Appelplatz, dominated the center, a vast open space where prisoners stood for hours during roll call, regardless of weather, regardless of illness, standing until the counting satisfied their captors, or until they collapsed. The crematorium rose at the camp's edge, its chimney a constant reminder of the camp's ultimate purpose. Smoke had poured from that chimney for years, carrying the ashes of the murdered into the sky above Weimar, the same sky that hung over the city's concert halls and libraries. The same wind that rustled through Goethe's garden also scattered the remains of those destroyed in his name. Beyond the main prisoner compound, separated by fences but sharing the same earth, stood the SS administrative buildings. Here the guards lived in relative comfort, close enough to oversee the machinery of death, far enough to pretend they were merely soldiers following orders. The railway sidings scarred the landscape where cattle cars had delivered their human cargo. Empty now, but the ground still bore the weight of all who had arrived here with hope and left as ash. The entire complex spread across Ettersburg like a cancer, its reach extending beyond the main camp to dozens of sub-camps scattered across the region. Buchenwald was not an isolated incident. It was the hub of a network of death, coordinating the destruction of human beings across an entire industrial system. Over 50,000 people would die here between 1937 and 1945. 50,000 stories ended. 50,000 futures erased, all within 5 miles of a city that claimed ignorance. To enter a Buchenwald barracks was to descend into a vision of hell designed by architects of suffering. These wooden structures, viewed from outside, seemed simple enough. Utilitarian military buildings, but inside existed conditions that defied human comprehension. 3-tier bunks, stacked from floor to ceiling, each tier designed to hold not one prisoner, but multiple men forced to share space barely sufficient for a single body. The air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, disease, despair, and death. Rows upon rows of these wooden sleeping platforms extended the entire length of each barrack. The corridor between them was so narrow that prisoners had to turn sideways to pass. There was no privacy, no dignity, no space to exist as an individual. Hundreds of men crammed into structures meant for dozens, their bodies pressed together, not for warmth or comfort, but because there simply was no other space. The bunks themselves told stories carved into wood by fingers desperate to leave some mark of their existence. Names scratched into rough timber, dates, messages to loved ones who would never read them, numbers assigned to replace identities. Each mark a silent scream against oblivion, a refusal to be forgotten, even as the camp worked systematically to erase every trace of individuality. Light filtered weakly through cracks in the walls and small windows that did nothing to alleviate the oppressive darkness of the space. In winter, freezing air knifed through every gap. In summer, the heat and stench became unbearable. Disease spread with ease in these conditions. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. The barracks were breeding grounds for death almost as efficient as the crematorium itself. Personal belongings, what few prisoners were allowed to keep, scattered across bunks, a worn shoe, a tin cup, a scrap of paper. These fragments of humanity stood in stark contrast to the dehumanizing design of the space. The view from the barracks door looked out onto the parade ground, where prisoners lined up each morning and evening for roll call that could last hours. This was their perspective on the world: wooden walls, wire fences, and the constant presence of death. April 11th, 1945, dawned over Buchenwald with a sound that prisoners had dreamed of for years: the rumble of American tanks approaching through the forest. The 3rd United States Army, under the command of General George S. Patton, had been driving deep into Germany, liberating towns and crushing the last desperate resistance of the Wehrmacht. But nothing in their military experience, nothing in their training, nothing in their wildest imagination could have prepared these soldiers for what they were about to discover. Sherman tanks rolled up to Buchenwald's gates like modern dragons, their armor scarred from weeks of combat, their crews battle-hardened veterans who had seen the worst of war. Behind them came jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, and infantry. The full weight of American military might descended on this place, where guards had once held absolute power. That power evaporated in moments as SS personnel either fled into the forest or surrendered to troops whose faces reflected confusion, turning rapidly to horror. General Patton himself arrived shortly after the initial liberation. George Patton was not a man easily shocked. He was profane, aggressive, a warrior who embraced violence as a tool of strategy. He had commanded armies across North Africa and Europe, witnessed death in every conceivable form that modern warfare could inflict. But when he stepped through Buchenwald's gates, even Patton faltered. The smell hit first, an overwhelming assault that made hardened soldiers vomit. Then the sights began to register. American medics rushed into the camp with stretchers, medical supplies, and humanitarian determination. But they stopped in their tracks, stunned by the scale of suffering before them. These were not wounded soldiers. These were men who weighed less than 70 pounds. Living skeletons whose eyes tracked movement but whose bodies could barely stand. Thousands of prisoners in various stages of starvation and disease, their striped uniforms hanging on frames that barely resembled human bodies anymore. The American forces moved through Buchenwald with organized efficiency, but their usual military bearing cracked under emotional weight. Soldiers who had fought their way across Europe broke down crying. Chaplains who had comforted dying men in battle fell to their knees in prayer, confronted with evil that theology seemed insufficient to address. Combat photographers, following Eisenhower's direct orders to document everything, struggled to operate their cameras through tears. Patton had received explicit instructions from Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower to document these camps extensively. Eisenhower understood something profound and terrifying: that one day, perhaps soon, people would deny this had happened, that future generations would call it exaggeration or propaganda, that the sheer impossibility of such evil would make it easy for the world to forget or minimize what had been done here. Every detail had to be recorded, every atrocity photographed, every survivor's testimony preserved. The American flag rose over Buchenwald that day, a symbol of liberation, but also of witness. The United States Army had not merely freed prisoners, they had become custodians of truth, responsible for ensuring that this evidence of humanity's capacity for evil would never be erased from history. Medical tents went up, food and water distribution began, carefully, as too much nourishment too quickly could kill men whose bodies had forgotten how to process sustenance. American soldiers moved through the camp in shock, their weapons lowered, their purpose shifted from combat to humanitarian rescue and historical documentation. They distributed blankets, offered comfort, and began the impossible task of helping men return from the edge of death. But more than anything, in those first hours of liberation, they bore witness. They saw, they could never unsee, and Patton understood that seeing was not enough. When the gates finally opened wide, survivors began to emerge from the barracks in scenes that would haunt American soldiers for the rest of their lives. These were not the triumphant moments of Hollywood liberation. There were no dramatic celebrations, no joyful crowds, no tearful embraces of freedom. Instead, skeletal figures shuffled forward on legs that barely supported their weight, their striped uniforms hanging like burial shrouds on bodies that had been systematically starved for months or years. The faces of the survivors told stories that words could never capture. Hollow eyes that had witnessed horrors beyond description stared out from skulls barely covered by skin. Cheekbones protruded sharply, every rib visible, arms like brittle sticks. These were men who had been transformed into living corpses through deliberate cruelty and systematic deprivation. Yet in those hollow eyes burned something the Nazis had failed to extinguish, the stubborn flame of human will to survive. Medical personnel rushed to provide care, but they quickly realized that conventional medicine was insufficient for what they faced. These men could not simply be fed and healed. Their bodies had adapted to starvation. Their systems had shut down non-essential functions just to keep hearts beating and lungs breathing. Refeeding had to be done with extreme caution. Water given in small amounts, nutrition introduced gradually. Even liberation itself posed dangers to bodies pushed beyond normal human endurance. Among the survivors were children, young boys who should have been playing, learning, growing. Instead, they had witnessed and experienced evil that no child should ever know exists. They stood together, silent and old beyond their years, youth stolen by systematic cruelty. Their presence was perhaps the most damning evidence of all, proof that Nazi ideology made no distinction between the elderly and the innocent, between adults and children. All were equally disposable in the machinery of genocide. Survivors began pointing to different locations throughout the camp, eager to show the Americans everything, to ensure that every crime was documented, every horror revealed. They wanted the world to see. They needed the world to know. Their voices, weak from malnutrition, nevertheless carried an urgency, born of fear that somehow this might still be covered up, that their suffering might be dismissed or minimized. The international nature of the prisoners became clear as Americans spoke with survivors. Political prisoners from Germany itself, resistance fighters from France, Polish intellectuals, Soviet prisoners of war, Jews from across occupied Europe, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexuals. Every group the Nazi regime had deemed unworthy of existence had been fed into Buchenwald's machinery of death. United in suffering, they now stood together in liberation, a living testament to both humanity's cruelty and its resilience. American soldiers wrapped blankets around survivors whose bodies could no longer regulate temperature. They offered cigarettes, chocolate, whatever comfort they could provide. But what the survivors needed most was simply to be seen, to have their humanity acknowledged after years of being treated as less than human, to know that the world would finally bear witness to what had been done to them. What American forces discovered in the days following liberation went beyond even the horror of the living survivors. Mass graves began to be uncovered across the campgrounds, bodies stacked in pits, layer upon layer of human remains, evidence of industrial-scale murder. These were not casualties of war. These were victims of systematic genocide, murdered not for military purpose, but simply because Nazi ideology had deemed them unworthy of life. Near the crematorium, American soldiers found piles of corpses that had not yet been burned, bodies stacked like cordwood, naked and emaciated, waiting their turn for the ovens. The crematorium itself stood as a monument to the industrialization of death. The ovens, still warm when Americans arrived, had been operating continuously for years. The Nazis had turned murder into a production process, complete with quotas, schedules, and efficiency reports. Storage rooms throughout the camp revealed mountains of personal belongings, thousands of pairs of shoes sorted by size, mountains of eyeglasses collected from victims who no longer needed to see, clothing stripped from the dead, folded and catalogued with German precision. These were not anonymous belongings. Each item had belonged to a specific person, with a name, a history, a family. Each represented a life ended and a future erased. The crematorium ovens stood open, their brick interiors stained with the residue of countless bodies. American soldiers and photographers documented every detail following Eisenhower's orders. The mechanics of murder had to be recorded so that no one could ever claim ignorance or deny the systematic nature of these crimes. Carts used to transport bodies to the ovens still sat nearby, their wooden beds stained dark with evidence of their purpose. Throughout the camp, torture devices and execution areas bore witness to the creative cruelty that had flourished here. These were not tools of war. These were instruments designed solely to inflict suffering. Some had been used for medical experiments, pseudo-scientific torture, masquerading as research, conducted on living human beings treated as laboratory animals. The rooms where these experiments took place stood as evidence of how far human depravity could descend when science divorced itself from ethics and medicine, abandoned its oath to do no harm. One discovery particularly horrified even the most hardened soldiers. Ilse Koch, the wife of Buchenwald's commandant, had collected souvenirs from murdered prisoners, lampshades made from tattooed human skin, preserved body parts, grotesque trophies that represented not the crimes of a military installation, but personal depravity that chose to memorialize murder as decoration. These items could not be explained away as wartime necessity or military discipline. They were evidence of evil for evil's sake. The camp's underground punishment cells, known as the bunker, revealed systematic torture that had been routine. Prisoners were beaten, starved, frozen, drowned, hanged, shot, or simply left to die in darkness. The walls bore scratches from fingernails, messages carved in desperation, bloodstains that told stories of suffering inflicted methodically and without mercy. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of the camp's meticulous records. The Nazis had documented everything with bureaucratic precision: lists of arrivals, cause of death records, inventory of confiscated property, work assignments, medical experiment results, all filed, organized, and preserved. The genocide had been conducted with paperwork, official stamps, and proper procedures. Evil had worn the face of bureaucratic efficiency. American forces photographed everything. Miles of film documented the evidence. Soldiers who had been hardened by combat found themselves unable to sleep, haunted by what they had witnessed and recorded. They understood that they were not merely liberating a camp. They were preserving evidence for history. They were ensuring that the truth could never be buried or denied. 5 days after liberation, on April 16, 1945, General George S. Patton made a decision that would force reckoning upon those who had lived in willful ignorance. American soldiers were dispatched into Weimar with orders that confused and angered the city's residents. They were not arresting war criminals. They were gathering the civilian elite. By the end of the day, nearly 1,000 of Weimar's most prominent citizens had been assembled in the town square under armed American guard. These were not random civilians. American military intelligence had carefully selected the city's leadership and influential classes: wealthy businessmen who had profited during the war years, factory owners whose plants had used slave labor from Buchenwald, doctors and professors from the university, lawyers who had served the Reich's legal system, bankers who had financed the machinery of war. Their wives, dressed in their finest clothes, carried themselves with the indignation of people unused to being ordered about by anyone. Many appeared in fur coats despite the spring weather, symbols of prosperity that stood in obscene contrast to what they were about to witness. Some demanded explanations in imperious tones, as if their social status granted them exemption from American military authority. Others stood confused, unable to comprehend why they were being treated this way when they had committed no crimes, or so they believed. A few seemed to understand what was coming and attempted to slip away, but American soldiers ensured no one left. The march began in silence. 1,000 civilians, accompanied by armed American troops, walking out of their beautiful city up the same road that thousands of prisoners had walked before them, the same road they had chosen not to see for years, the same road that connected their world of culture and prosperity to the hell that existed just 5 miles away. This time there would be no looking away. This time there would be no comfortable denial. As the column climbed toward Ettersburg, The spring sunshine that had blessed Weimar's streets began to seem cruelly bright. Birds sang in the forest, indifferent to human horror. Some civilians struggled with the walk, unused to physical exertion, accustomed to automobiles and servants. Their discomfort was noted but not accommodated. They would walk every step that prisoners had walked, though they walked on full stomachs and in good shoes. The smell reached them before the camp came into view. That distinctive, unmistakable odor of death and decay. Some civilians covered their noses with handkerchiefs. Others gagged. A few tried to turn back, but American soldiers firmly directed them forward. There would be no retreat, no escape. They would see what they had chosen to ignore. When Buchenwald's gates came into sight, the column slowed. Some civilians stopped entirely, needing to be urged forward by American troops. The reality they had denied was about to become undeniable. The comfortable distance they had maintained was about to collapse, and Patton had designed this march to ensure that every step, every smell, every sight would be seared into their memories forever. The moment Weimar's citizens passed through Buchenwald's gates, the carefully constructed walls of denial began to crumble. American soldiers led them systematically through the camp, ensuring they saw everything, missed nothing, understood completely. This was not a quick tour. This was a forced confrontation with truth, organized to strip away every excuse, every rationalization, every comfortable lie. First came the mass graves. American forces had begun excavating the burial pits, revealing layer after layer of bodies. Well-dressed German civilians stood at the edge of these pits, staring down at the unmistakable evidence of mass murder. Some covered their mouths, some turned away reflexively, only to be firmly directed by American soldiers to look, to see, to bear witness. Women in fur coats wept. Men in business suits stood frozen, their faces draining of color. Next came the piles of corpses near the crematorium, bodies that had not yet been buried, stacked in the open air. The April sun had accelerated decomposition. The sight was beyond anything these civilians had imagined. Several vomited, others collapsed to the ground, but American soldiers gave them time to recover and then moved them forward. The tour continued. The witnessing continued. The survivors themselves provided perhaps the most powerful testimony. Living skeletons in striped uniforms watched silently as Weimar's wealthy and educated classes walked past. Some survivors stood absolutely still, their hollow eyes following the civilians' movements. Others pointed at themselves, at their bodies reduced to bone, at their fellow prisoners, at the barracks, at the crematorium. Silent accusations hung in the air. You saw us. You passed us in the streets. You looked away. American soldiers brought the civilians to the barracks, forcing them to enter and see the conditions in which prisoners had lived. The stench inside was overwhelming. The impossibly cramped bunks, the complete absence of sanitation or dignity. Elegant German women in expensive dresses stood in these spaces where hundreds of men had been forced to exist like animals. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. The crematorium ovens stood open for inspection. Civilians were brought close enough to see the residue inside, to understand that these ovens had been used continuously for years to burn human bodies. The mechanics of industrialized murder were explained in detail. This was not rumor. This was not propaganda. This was physical infrastructure designed for one purpose: the systematic destruction of human beings. Then came Ilse Koch's collection, the lampshades, the preserved skin, the grotesque souvenirs of murder. American soldiers watched the civilians' reactions carefully as these items were displayed and explained. This evidence destroyed any remaining claims that the camp had been merely a detention facility, or that deaths had been accidental or due to wartime hardships. This was proof of deliberate, personal evil. Throughout the tour, survivors occasionally approached the civilians. Some spoke, some simply stood close, letting their physical condition speak for itself. An elderly Jewish professor from Weimar recognized a businessman from the city and simply stared at him in silence. A young boy survivor pointed at a woman in a fur coat and said quietly in German, "You saw us at the train station." She had no response. American photographers documented everything, including the civilians' reactions. Pictures were taken of wealthy Germans standing before piles of corpses. Images captured the moment denial broke on individual faces. These photographs would become historical evidence, not just of the camps themselves, but of German civilian knowledge and complicity. The photographic record would preserve this reckoning for generations. Some civilians maintained emotional control, their faces set in stone, refusing to show reaction. Others broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably as the full weight of what had existed 5 miles from their homes became undeniable. A few still attempted to make excuses. They hadn't known. They had no power to stop it. They were just ordinary people, but their words sounded hollow, even to themselves, surrounded by mountains of evidence. The parade ground provided a final gathering point. American soldiers assembled the civilians in the same space where prisoners had stood for hours during roll call. They were made to stand there, surrounded by the totality of Buchenwald, the barracks, the fences, the watchtowers, the crematorium, the survivors, the evidence. For the first time, they stood not as visitors to another world, but as participants in the reality that had existed here all along. Survivors gathered around the edges of the parade ground, watching the civilians with expressions that mixed accusation, vindication, and profound sadness. Some had family members who had disappeared into camps like this. Some had lost everyone they loved to the machinery of genocide. Now they watched as those who had claimed ignorance were forced to confront truth. The silence on that parade ground was profound. No one spoke. The weight of what these civilians had seen, what they now knew beyond any doubt, pressed down like physical force. The comfortable distance between Weimar and Buchenwald had been erased. The psychological barriers that had allowed them to live in beauty while others died in horror had been destroyed. They could never again claim they didn't know. The march back down Ettersberg Hill bore no resemblance to the march up. The same people who had climbed with confusion and indignation descended in traumatized silence. Faces that had shown anger or superiority now displayed shock, horror, and shame. Some walked mechanically, as if their minds had shut down to protect themselves from what they had witnessed. Others wept openly, their carefully maintained composure shattered beyond repair. The spring sunshine that had seemed so bright during the ascent now felt obscene. How could the sun shine on a world where such things existed? How could birds sing? How could the forest smell of pine and new growth, when just beyond the trees existed evidence of humanity's darkest capacity for evil? The disconnect between the beauty of nature and the horror of human action became unbearable for many who walked that road. American soldiers maintained their escort but said little. The civilians were not prisoners in the traditional sense, but they were forever changed by what they had seen. Some would never recover from this day. The images of mass graves, of skeletal survivors, of crematorium ovens, of Ilse Koch's grotesque souvenirs would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Patton had intended exactly this effect. He wanted the truth burned into their memories so deeply that forgetting would be impossible. As Weimar came back into view, the city itself seemed different. The Baroque buildings still stood elegant and untouched. The cobblestone streets still reflected centuries of culture. Goethe's house still anchored the city's claim to intellectual legacy. But now these things existed under a shadow that could never be lifted. The beauty of Weimar would forever be inseparable from the horror of Buchenwald. The culture that had produced music and philosophy had also produced, or at least enabled, systematic genocide. The civilians dispersed back to their homes in silence. There was no discussion, no communal processing of what they had witnessed. Each person retreated into private horror, into private reckoning with what they now knew beyond doubt. How does one process the knowledge that mass murder occurred 5 miles from one's home? How does one reconcile years of claimed ignorance with evidence so overwhelming that denial becomes impossible? General Patton understood what many would take years to fully grasp. The march to Buchenwald was not about punishing these civilians with exposure to horror, though many experienced it as punishment. It was about destroying the psychological foundation upon which future denial could be built. Dwight D. Eisenhower had warned that one day people would claim the Holocaust never happened, that the camps were exaggerated, that the photographs were propaganda. The forced march ensured that at least 1,000 witnesses from the heart of German culture could never make such claims. In the years that followed, many of those who marched to Buchenwald that day struggled with what they had seen. Some developed lasting trauma. Some dedicated the remainder of their lives to education about the Holocaust, becoming witnesses who ensured younger generations understood what had happened. Others retreated into silence, unable to speak about that day even to their own families. A few died by suicide, unable to live with the knowledge of what had existed so close while they lived in comfort. The city of Weimar itself would carry this legacy forward. Tourism that had once focused on Goethe and German cultural achievement would now be inseparable from Buchenwald. Visitors came not just to celebrate German culture, but to confront German history. The city that had claimed not to know became a permanent testament to the consequences of willful ignorance. Buchenwald stands today as more than a memorial to those who died there. It is a warning carved into history itself. The barracks remain, preserved, but no longer housing prisoners. The crematorium stands as evidence that cannot be denied. The parade ground where thousands stood in suffering is now walked by tourists and students who come to learn and to remember. The entire site exists as a permanent challenge to anyone who claims that ordinary people are powerless in the face of evil. The forced march from Weimar teaches a lesson that extends far beyond 1945. Evil does not require monsters alone. It survives and flourishes through the complicity of ordinary people who choose comfort over courage, who choose ignorance over awareness, who choose silence over action. The people of Weimar were not uniquely evil. They were human beings who made choices, who decided that their beautiful city and comfortable lives mattered more than investigating strange smells or asking about trains that arrived in the night. Patton's decision to force that march up Ettersberg Hill was controversial, even at the time. Some questioned whether it was appropriate to subject civilians to such trauma. Some worried about the psychological impact, but history has vindicated his choice. Those 1,000 witnesses became living proof that German civilians knew or could have known what was happening. Their testimony became evidence that the Holocaust was not a secret known only to Nazi leadership, but a reality that existed in plain sight for those willing to see. As the decades pass and the last survivors and witnesses die, Buchenwald itself remains. The physical space preserves the truth in concrete and steel and wood. But the story of the forced march adds another dimension. Evidence that confronting evil is necessary, that bearing witness is not optional, that claiming ignorance is a choice, not a defense. Today, when we look at Buchenwald, we see both the horror of what humans can do to each other and the courage of those who survive. We see evidence of systematic genocide and proof of the human spirit's resilience, but we also see the shadows of those who lived 5 miles away, in comfort and culture. And we understand that distance is no excuse, that proximity to evil creates responsibility. The lesson echoes across time. We must never look away. We must never claim we did not know. We must never choose the comfort of denial over the difficulty of truth, because the price of that choice is measured in millions of lives lost, in generations destroyed, in humanity's capacity for darkness allowed to flourish unchecked. Buchenwald stands as eternal testimony. The forced march from Weimar stands as eternal lesson, and together they remind us that silence in the face of evil is not neutrality. It is complicity. It is the distance between what we see and what we choose to acknowledge. And that distance, no matter how carefully we measure it, is never far enough to claim innocence when the truth finally demands to be seen.